The lights of orbital station Meridian 7 flickered in that tired way that told Marcus Cole the maintenance crews had given up again. And he found himself not caring, because giving up was something he understood very well these days. He guided his old freighter through the docking clamps with the ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. And the metal groaned as it settled into place like an old man lowering himself into a chair after a long day of work that never seemed to end. Marcus sat in the pilot's seat for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the control panel without really seeing it. Because seeing things meant thinking about them, and thinking led to remembering, and remembering was the enemy he fought every single day. 11 years he had been doing this, hauling cargo from one station to another across the vast emptiness of space. And in all that time, he had spoken to other beings only when absolutely necessary, because words required energy, and energy required hope, and hope had died on Kepler 2-2b along with everything else that mattered. His wife Sarah had loved watching the twin suns set over the colony fields, and his daughter Emma had just learned to ride a bicycle on the dusty paths between the habitat domes. And then the plague came sweeping through like a thief in the night and took them both within a week, while Marcus survived because the universe apparently had a cruel sense of humor. He shook his head hard and forced himself to stand up, because sitting and thinking was dangerous territory. And he had cargo manifests to file and fuel to purchase, and all the meaningless tasks that kept a man moving forward, when forward was the only direction that did not lead straight into madness. The station corridor was crowded with beings of a dozen different species, all of them walking with purpose and direction, and the comfortable knowledge that they belong somewhere in this vast galaxy. And Marcus moved through them like a ghost, because that was what he had become over the years. Other species found humans unsettling, and Marcus had heard all the whispers over the years about how humans felt too much and cared too deeply, and formed attachments with the intensity of a dying star. And he had decided long ago that if the galaxy wanted him to be alone, then he would be alone, and he would not apologize for the crime of having a heart that refused to stop beating. He completed his business at the cargo office with minimal conversation and turned to head back to his ship when something caught his eye near the refuse processing units at the far end of the dock. A figure sat huddled against the cold metal wall in a spot where the lights barely reached. And at first, Marcus thought it was just another pile of discarded cargo containers, because beings did not sit in such places, unless something had gone terribly wrong. But then the figure moved, and Marcus saw the unmistakable shimmer of Valkyrie skin catching the dim light. And he stopped walking, because Valkyrie did not belong in refuse corners, any more than diamonds belonged in garbage heaps. The Valkyrie were a proud species, known throughout the galaxy for their elegant appearance and their tradition of arranged political marriages that bound powerful families together across star systems. And seeing one here in the shadows made no sense at all. Marcus told himself to keep walking, because other people's problems were not his problems, and he had enough weight on his shoulders without adding more. But his feet refused to obey, and instead carried him closer to the huddled figure. As he approached, he could see it was a female Valkyrie, her tall, slender form wrapped in ceremonial marriage silks that had once been beautiful, but now hung torn and stained with what might have been tears, or might have been something worse. Her skin should have been a brilliant, iridescent blue that shifted like sunlight on water, but stress and despair had dulled it to a pale gray that spoke of suffering no being should have to endure alone. Station security walked past without even glancing in her direction, and a group of Krethar merchants actually laughed as they passed her hiding spot. And Marcus felt something hot and angry stir in his chest at the casual cruelty of it all. The Valkyrie were not popular among the so-called superior races of the Galactic Union because they were considered too emotional and too gentle and too willing to feel things that more logical species had evolved beyond. And apparently, that made them acceptable targets for mockery and abandonment. Marcus stopped a few feet away from her and cleared his throat because he had no idea what to say, but staying silent seemed worse than saying something stupid. The female Valkyrie flinched at the sound and looked up at him with silver eyes that held more pain than Marcus had seen since he last looked in a mirror. And for a moment, neither of them spoke because some things were too big for words. "You okay?" Marcus finally asked, and the question felt ridiculously inadequate given the obvious answer, but it was the best he could manage. She stared at him as if he had spoken in a language she did not understand, and perhaps in a way he had because kindness from strangers was clearly not something she expected. "Why do you ask?" She replied in halting Galactic common, her voice rough from crying or screaming or both. Marcus shrugged because he did not have a good answer, and lying seemed pointless at this stage of his life. "Because you look like you need someone to ask," he said simply. The female Valkyrie continued to stare at him, and Marcus realized that she was trying to figure out his angle because every species in the galaxy always had an angle, and kindness without expectation was apparently as alien as he was. "I am nothing," she whispered, and the words came out broken and jagged like glass that had been shattered and stepped on too many times. "I am rejected and worthless, and you should not waste your time on something that has no value." Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the self-hatred in her voice because he recognized it as intimately as his own reflection, and something inside him made a decision before his brain could talk him out of it. He lowered himself to the ground beside her, ignoring the cold metal and the curious stares of passing beings. And he sat there in the shadows with her because sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone was simply refuse to let them be alone. "I have got nowhere else to be," Marcus said quietly, and for the first time in 11 years that was not entirely true, because suddenly this refuse corner felt more important than anywhere else in the galaxy. Her name was Lyris Talvin, and she had been born for one purpose and one purpose only: to be a bride worthy of a powerful alliance between her family and the Krethar, warlord who ruled 3 star systems with an iron fist. She told Marcus her story in halting words that stumbled over each other like frightened children, and he listened without interrupting because listening was something humans were strangely good at, even though most species considered it a waste of time. From the moment of her birth, Lyris had been shaped and molded like clay in the hands of a sculptor who cared nothing for her feelings and everything for her usefulness. And every day of her existence had been dedicated to becoming the perfect political wife. She learned 17 languages and memorized the customs of 40 different species and trained her body to move with grace and her face to show only what was appropriate and her heart to want only what she was told to want. Her family invested enormous resources in her development because the marriage alliance with the Krethar would bring wealth and power and status beyond measure. And Lyris understood from childhood that her value as a person was directly tied to her ability to complete this single transaction. She had traveled for 3 months to reach Meridian 7, where the marriage ceremony was scheduled to take place. And she had spent every moment of that journey preparing herself mentally for a life of service to a being she had never met, but was taught to honor above all things. The Krethar warlord had arrived at the station with an entourage of 50 servants and advisors, and Lyris had knelt before him in the traditional pose of submission that her people had practiced for 10,000 years. He had looked at her for exactly 12 seconds before declaring her unacceptable. "The empathy readings are too high," Lyris whispered to Marcus as tears began to flow down her pale cheeks. "They scanned my neural patterns and found that I feel things too strongly and too deeply, and that makes me defective." Marcus felt his hands curl into fists at his sides because the idea of measuring someone's worth by how much they felt was the most backward thing he had ever heard. "They called me broken," Lyris continued, her voice cracking under the weight of remembered humiliation. They said I would be too emotional to serve properly, and that my excessive feelings would be a liability in political situations, and that no creature of worth would accept damaged goods. The warlord had rejected her publicly in front of hundreds of witnesses, and Lyris had been stripped of her ceremonial status and cast out of the delegation like spoiled food being thrown to the recyclers. She had tried to contact her family, but they had already received word of her rejection, and their response had been swift and absolute. My mother told me I was dead to them, Lyris said, with a hollow laugh that held no humor. She said that a rejected bride brings shame upon her entire bloodline, and that it would be better for everyone if I simply ceased to exist. Marcus wanted to say something comforting, but every word that came to mind felt pathetically inadequate in the face of such complete abandonment. Lyris had been on the station for 6 days with no money and no resources and no legal status because her family had revoked her citizenship and the Krethar had refused to take responsibility for her. She had slept in maintenance quarters and eaten scraps from waste containers and avoided security patrols because beings without status could be detained and sold to labor camps on the outer rim. I tried to find work, she said quietly, but no one wants to hire a rejected Volcari. We are considered unreliable and overly emotional and prone to making decisions based on feelings rather than logic. The way she said it made clear that she had heard these criticisms so many times that she had started to believe them herself. Among my people, there is no path back from rejection, Lyris explained. I cannot return home, and I cannot find a new marriage match, and I cannot work in any position of importance. I am nothing more than evidence of my family's failure to produce quality offspring. Marcus sat in silence for a long moment because he needed time to process the sheer cruelty of a system that could create someone as clearly intelligent and capable as Lyris, and then throw her away because her heart was too big. Let me see if I understand this correctly, Marcus finally said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Your whole society decided you were worthless because you feel things too deeply? Lyris nodded miserably. And this warlord rejected you because your brain scans showed too much capacity for empathy and emotion? Another nod. And your own family disowned you because having feelings is apparently some kind of genetic defect that brings shame to your bloodline. Lyris looked at him with confusion because she could not understand why he was repeating things that were obviously true to anyone with basic knowledge of galactic society. Marcus shook his head slowly, and something that might have been a smile crossed his weathered face. That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard, he said flatly. And I once met a guy who tried to transport live plasma in cardboard boxes. Lyris blinked at him in shock because no one had ever called the sacred traditions of Velcari society stupid before. Feeling too much is not a defect, Marcus continued with growing intensity. Empathy is not a weakness. The ability to understand what others are going through and to care about their suffering is literally the only thing that makes any of this cold, empty universe worth living in. He gestured broadly at the station around them with its sterile walls and its indifferent crowds and its complete lack of anything resembling warmth or compassion. Everyone out there is so proud of being logical and efficient and emotionally detached, Marcus said, and look what they have built. A galaxy full of beings who would walk past a crying woman in a refuse corner without even slowing down. Lyris stared at him with wide silver eyes that held something she had not felt in days, something that looked dangerously like hope. You really believe that? She asked in a voice barely above a whisper. I really believe that, Marcus confirmed. Where I come from, we have a saying that the heart knows things that reason cannot understand. And I would rather have one person who feels too much than 1,000 who feel nothing at all. Lyris began to cry again, but this time the tears were different, cleaner somehow, like rain washing away dust that had accumulated over years of being told she was worthless. Marcus reached out and took her hand in his, and he did not let go. Marcus did not know what possessed him to say the words that came out of his mouth next. And later he would wonder if perhaps he had finally lost what remained of his sanity after 11 years of solitude among the stars. Maybe it was the loneliness that had eaten away at his soul like rust on old metal. Or maybe it was seeing the same gentle kindness in Lyris's silver eyes that he remembered from his wife Sarah's face on their wedding day. Maybe humans really were as unpredictable and irrational as every other species in the galaxy believed them to be. Whatever the reason, Marcus opened his mouth and said 2 words that would change both their lives forever. "Marry me." Lyris went completely still, as if someone had pressed a pause button on her existence. And for several seconds she did not even breathe. "I do not understand," she finally managed to say. "Is this some kind of human humor that I am not familiar with?" "No joke," Marcus replied, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. "I am completely serious." Lyris shook her head rapidly, as if trying to dislodge water from her ears. "You cannot be serious. You do not know me. We met less than an hour ago. Humans do not do arranged marriages, and even if they did, you would gain nothing from bonding with a rejected Velkari, who has no status and no wealth and no family connections." Marcus shrugged because everything she said was technically true, and he had no logical argument to counter any of it. "I am not arranging anything," he said calmly. "Arrangements imply contracts and negotiations and 2 parties trying to get the best deal. I am just asking. Simple question with a simple answer." "But why?" Lyris demanded, her voice rising with something between hope and terror. "Why would you want to marry someone you just found crying in a garbage corner? What could you possibly see in me that the warlord did not?" Marcus thought about the question for a moment because it deserved a real answer. "I see someone who has been told her whole life that her greatest strength is actually her greatest weakness," he said slowly. "I see someone whose capacity for love and empathy is so big that it scared a warlord. I see someone who deserves to be valued for who she is rather than what she can provide." Lyris stared at him with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Look," Marcus continued, "I have got a ship. It is old, and it smells funny, and the heating system makes a weird noise every 3rd Tuesday, but it flies, and it is mine. I've got no family left and no real connections, and nothing waiting for me, except more cargo runs to more stations full of people who do not care if I live or die." He paused and ran a hand through his graying hair. "You have got nothing and nowhere to go. I have got nothing and no one to share it with. Seems to me like we could solve each other's problems." Lyris was crying again, but she was also laughing in that confused way people do when the universe suddenly stops making any kind of sense. "This is not how things work," she protested weakly. "There are supposed to be negotiations and contracts and genetic compatibility assessments and family approval processes that take months or even years." "Says who?" Marcus asked with a raised eyebrow. "Says everyone?" "Says every civilized species in the galaxy. Says 10,000 years of Velkari tradition." "Well, I am human," Marcus replied with something that was almost a grin. "And humans have a long history of ignoring what everyone says we are supposed to do. We are stubborn like that." Lyris looked at him with an expression that might have been the beginning of wonder. "Among my people, a marriage is a transaction," she said quietly. 2 families exchange resources and both sides must benefit. What benefit could you possibly gain from marrying me?" Marcus considered the question seriously because Lyris deserved honesty. "Company," he said simply. "Someone to talk to during the long hauls between stars. Someone who might actually care whether I make it back safely. Someone who can feel things deeply in a galaxy that seems determined to feel nothing at all." He met her silver eyes with his own tired brown ones. I have been alone for 11 years and I'm tired of it. Not tired of living, but tired of living without anyone to share it with. You said you were bred to be a companion? Well, I actually need one. Lyris was silent for a long moment, and Marcus could see the war playing out across her features as everything she had been taught fought against everything she had just heard. What if you regret it? She asked in a small voice. What if you wake up tomorrow and realize you made a terrible mistake by binding yourself to damaged goods? Marcus felt his heart crack a little at the self-hatred in her words. You are not damaged goods, he said firmly. Some idiot who measures worth in neural scan numbers could not see what was standing right in front of him. That is his loss. I would like it to be my gain, if you will let me. He held out his hand to her, palm up, offering rather than demanding. I am not promising you happiness or wealth or status, Marcus said honestly. I am promising you that you will never have to sleep in a maintenance corridor again. I am promising that someone will actually listen when you talk. I am promising that for as long as I draw breath, you will matter to someone in this cold galaxy. Lyris looked at his outstretched hand as if it were an alien artifact from a species she had never encountered. My people would say you are insane, she whispered. My people would probably agree, Marcus admitted with a small laugh. The galaxy will think we are both fools. The galaxy can think whatever it wants. It usually does anyway. Lyris reached out slowly, trembling, and placed her hand in his. Yes, she said, and the word came out broken and beautiful like the first light of dawn after the longest night. Yes, I will marry you. Marcus closed his fingers around hers and felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen for 11 years beginning to thaw. Then let us go find someone to make it official, he said. I think there is a chapel on level 7 that does interfaith ceremonies. They stood up together, two broken people leaning on each other, and walked out of the shadows and into whatever future was waiting for them. Behind them, the refuse corner sat empty, no longer holding the weight of abandoned hope, and the station lights flickered on as if the universe itself was finally paying attention. The chapel on level 7 was small and smelled faintly of incense from a dozen different worlds. And the officiant was a tired old Melleran priest who had seen enough strange things in his centuries of service that nothing surprised him anymore. Marcus and Lyris stood before him in their mismatched clothing, she in her torn ceremonial silks and he in his stained cargo hauler jumpsuit, and they exchanged vows that were simple and direct and utterly sincere. Do you take this being as your partner in all things? The priest asked Marcus in a bored voice. I do, Marcus replied without hesitation. And do you accept this being as your partner in all things? The priest asked Lyris. Lyris hesitated for just a moment, still unable to fully believe this was happening, and then she said, I do, in a voice that trembled with hope. Then, by the authority granted to me by the Galactic Interfaith Council, I declare you bonded partners. You may seal your union however your respective customs dictate. Marcus was not sure what Velkari customs dictated, but human customs were pretty clear, so he leaned in and kissed his new wife gently on her blue forehead. Lyris gasped at the contact because touch was sacred among her people and freely given. Affection was almost unheard of in arranged marriages. The only witness to their union was a sanitation drone that had wandered into the chapel by accident and now hovered near the back wall, its sensors blinking in what might have been mechanical confusion. They left the chapel as husband and wife, two strangers who had somehow become family in the span of a single evening, and Marcus felt lighter than he had in 11 years. But the galaxy was watching, as the galaxy always watched, and word of their union spread faster than light through the gossip networks that connected every station and colony and ship. A human had married a rejected Velkari bride. The reactions came swiftly, and they were not kind. The Krethar warlord, who had discarded Lyris, was the first to respond, filing a formal complaint with the Galactic Union, claiming that Marcus had stolen his property. The female was rejected but not released, his lawyers argued. Under Crethon law, she remained the property of House Vorketh until formally disposed of through proper channels. Marcus received the legal notice while eating breakfast on his ship, and he laughed so hard that coffee came out of his nose. "They cannot be serious," he said to Lyris, who was reading the document with growing fear. "They threw you away like garbage, and now they want you back?" "Crethar do not like losing," Lyris explained nervously. "Even things they do not want. It is about pride and dominance and making sure everyone knows they are in control." The Valkyrie Diplomatic Corps issued their own statement, declaring the marriage invalid and demanding that Lyris be returned to her homeworld for rehabilitation and reassignment. A defective unit must be properly processed, the statement read. Allowing her to remain bonded to an alien species sets a dangerous precedent that could encourage other flawed individuals to seek escape from their rightful obligations. Marcus read this statement aloud, and his voice grew colder with every word. "Did they just call you a defective unit?" he asked quietly. Lyris nodded, her eyes downcast. "It is standard terminology for rejected brides. We are considered products that failed quality control." "That is absolutely disgusting," Marcus said flatly. Other species joined the chorus of criticism. The Veshan High Council expressed grave concerns about humans interfering with established cultural practices. The Morvith hierarchy suggested that this incident proved humans were too emotional and impulsive to be trusted with serious diplomatic responsibilities. Even some human politicians, eager to maintain good relations with the powerful species of the Union, suggested that Marcus should consider the diplomatic implications of his hasty decision. But then something unexpected happened, something that reminded the galaxy why humans were both loved and feared in equal measure. Human colonies across the sector began responding to the news, and their responses were nothing like what the Galactic Union expected. Thousands of messages flooded the communication channels, messages of support and solidarity and fierce protective anger. If feeling too much is a defect, then humanity is proudly defective, wrote one popular commentator on Earth. The galaxy measures worth in productivity and utility, but we measure worth in love, declared a viral post from the colonies. Human social networks exploded with outrage that any being could be called worthless simply for having the capacity to care deeply about others. Images of Marcus and Lyris's simple wedding ceremony were shared millions of times with captions like, "This is what real value looks like," and "Empathy is not a bug, it is a feature." The Earth ambassador to the Galactic Union issued a formal statement that was broadcast across every major network. Humanity recognizes the marriage of Marcus Cole and Lyris Talvin as legitimate and binding, the ambassador declared. "We will defend their union with every legal and diplomatic tool at our disposal." She paused for effect before delivering the line that would be quoted for generations. "If the galaxy considers compassion a flaw, then humanity will proudly remain flawed. And we will welcome anyone else who suffers from the same beautiful defect." The response from human colonies was overwhelming. Offers of legal assistance and financial support poured in. Human merchants announced they would boycott any species that continued to harass the couple. Several human military officers quietly let it be known that any attempt to forcibly separate Marcus from his wife would be met with appropriate resistance. The Galactic Union found itself facing something it had not anticipated: the terrifying solidarity of a species that bonded with things the way humans bonded. The Crethor warlord withdrew his complaint after receiving a detailed breakdown of how much revenue he would lose if human traders stopped doing business with his territories. The Valkyrie Diplomatic Corps quietly dropped their demands after several human corporations threatened to cancel mining contracts on Valkyrie worlds. Within 2 weeks, the controversy had faded into an embarrassed silence broken only by occasional grumbling about those crazy humans and their emotional attachments. Marcus stood on the bridge of his ship with Lyris beside him, watching the stars drift past the viewport. "I cannot believe they just gave up," Lyris said softly. "The Krethar never give up. The diplomatic corps never backs down." Marcus smiled and put his arm around her shoulders. "Turns out humanity is pretty stubborn when someone threatens our family," he said. "And you are family now, whether the galaxy likes it or not." Lyris leaned into his embrace, and for the first time since her rejection, she felt truly safe. "Your species is very strange," she murmured. "Yeah," Marcus agreed happily. "We really are." 6 months had passed since that evening on Meridian 7, when a lonely human found an abandoned bride in a refuse corner, and everything had changed in ways neither of them could have predicted. The old freighter that Marcus had called the Wandering Star now bore a new name painted in bright letters across its hull: the Sheltering Sky. Lyris had suggested the name one night while they drifted between star systems, and Marcus had loved it immediately because it captured exactly what he wanted their home to be. The ship itself had transformed as well, no longer just a vessel for hauling cargo, but a genuine home filled with warmth and color and the small personal touches that made a space truly livable. Lyris had discovered that she had a talent for interior design that her training as a political bride had never allowed her to explore, and she had turned the bare metal corridors into something beautiful. Tapestries from a dozen different worlds hung on the walls, alongside photographs and artwork and strange little souvenirs collected from their travels together. The galley that Marcus had used only for reheating packaged meals now smelled of actual cooking as Lyris experimented with recipes from both their cultures. She had learned to make something called grilled cheese sandwiches, which she considered a masterpiece of human culinary innovation. And Marcus had learned to appreciate the subtle flavors of Velkhari tea ceremonies. But the biggest change was not in the ship. It was in the people who lived there. Lyris had discovered something remarkable about humans during her months with Marcus. They did not just tolerate emotions, they celebrated them. Marcus taught her that it was acceptable to laugh loudly at jokes, even when other species considered such displays undignified. He showed her that crying during sad stories was not weakness, but proof that a heart was working exactly as it should. He argued passionately about things that mattered to him and then made up with genuine apologies and warm embraces. A cycle that Velkhari culture would have considered chaotic, but that Lyris found wonderfully alive. Her defect, that had caused her so much pain, turned out to be the very foundation of their partnership. Her empathic abilities allowed her to sense when Marcus was struggling with his old grief. Those dark days when memories of Sarah and Emma threatened to pull him under. She would hold space for his pain without trying to fix it or minimize it, simply letting him know that he was not alone in his sorrow. And slowly, gently, the frozen places in his heart began to thaw. Marcus returned the gift in his own way, constantly reminding Lyris that her sensitivity was precious rather than shameful. "You feel what others cannot or will not feel," he told her one evening. "That is not a weakness. That is a superpower." Word of their unusual marriage had spread far beyond the initial controversy, reaching beings across the galaxy who recognized something of themselves in the story. A message arrived one day from a Deshan engineer named Corvin, who had been expelled from his guild for excessive curiosity. "They said I asked too many questions," Corvin wrote. "They said proper Deshans accept established knowledge without constantly seeking new understanding. Is there room on your ship for someone else who does not fit?" Marcus and Lyris looked at each other, and the answer was obvious. Corvin arrived 2 weeks later with his toolkit and his endless questions and his deep shame at being considered abnormal. And within a month, he had improved the ship's engines by 30% while learning that curiosity was not a crime, but a gift. Then came Vesa, a Morvith soldier discharged from the military for excessive mercy, after she refused to execute civilian prisoners during a border conflict. "I could not do it," she said when she arrived at their airlock. "They were just farmers caught in the wrong place. How is killing defenseless people honorable?" The Morvith valued strength and ruthlessness above all things, and Vesa's compassion had marked her as defective in the eyes of her people. She found a home on the sheltering sky, where her fierce protective instincts and her refusal to abandon those weaker than herself were considered virtues, rather than flaws. Others followed, a Krethar communication specialist, who had been punished for forming emotional attachments with her colleagues. A Melloran artist whose work was considered too provocative because it made viewers feel things. A young Velkari male who had fled his homeworld rather than enter an arranged marriage he found repugnant. The sheltering sky became a haven for the galaxy's misfits, those whose greatest crimes were caring too much and feeling too deeply and refusing to be the cold, efficient beings their societies demanded. Marcus found himself transformed from a solitary cargo hauler into something like a captain of a very unusual crew, and the responsibility sat surprisingly well on his shoulders. He was still gruff and practical and utterly human, but now he had people who needed him, and that made all the difference. One night, during a long, quiet stretch between stars, Lyris found Marcus sitting alone in the observation lounge, staring out at the infinite darkness. She sat down beside him and took his hand without speaking, because sometimes presence was more valuable than words. "I was thinking about Sarah and Emma," Marcus said after a while, "wondering what they would think of all this." Lyris squeezed his hand gently. "I think they would be proud of you," she offered. "You took your grief and turned it into something that helps others." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the stars. "The warlord called you broken," he said quietly. "But I think maybe you were just waiting for somewhere you could be whole." Lyris rested her head on his shoulder and smiled. "I think perhaps I was waiting for a species strange enough to see me as whole," she replied. "Humans are very good at seeing value where others see only defects." "We're stubborn that way," Marcus agreed. "Too stubborn to accept what the galaxy tells us is true." Outside the viewport, the stars stretched on forever, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to the small, warm ship that drifted among them. But inside the sheltering sky, there was light and laughter and the peculiar magic that happened when broken people chose to be broken together. "Do you regret it?" Lyris asked softly. "Marrying a stranger you found in a refuse corner." Marcus turned to look at his wife, this beautiful alien woman with her blue skin and silver eyes and her heart that was big enough to feel the pain of an entire galaxy. "Not for a single second," he said honestly. "Best decision I ever made." Lyris felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were good tears, happy tears, the kind of tears that came from being loved exactly as you were. "Your species really is very strange," she whispered. "Yeah," Marcus agreed, pulling her closer. "But I think that might be our greatest strength." And somewhere in the vast, uncaring cosmos, one small ship full of rejected misfits flew on toward tomorrow, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with heroic quests, but with simple acts of kindness in the darkness. Home was not a place. It was the people who refused to let you be alone. And that was something humans had always understood.